What's up, gentlemen? This is Rising Phoenix Podcast about how to rise up after your divorce. I'm your host, divorce coach, Michael Rhodes. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Dr. Lee. Dr. Lee, why don't you just jump right into it and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, my professional name would be Dr. Leon Seltzer, but I prefer being called Lee. I have a doctorate in psychology. I've been doing therapy for some 40 years, and I also have a PhD in English, and I functioned as an English professor for over a decade.
Hmm.
So what I thought was, given my current age, that it was time to stop doing longer term psychotherapy, retire my license as a psychologist, limit my practice to consultations,
Hmm.
uh, both corporate and personal, where I would function basically more as a facilitator, particularly since I believe that all significant change or healing comes from within.
Hmm.
So for it to be long lasting, it shouldn't be coming from an external authoritative source as such, but from a person who has been facilitated to ask themselves the right questions and deal with maybe past trauma that's gotten in the way so they can affect the change that they're really longing for.
Gotcha. And how I came across you is like many folks that have been guests on this podcast is psychologytoday.com, and you wrote an article about essentially personality and can people change? And I think that's an important question for someone going through a divorce because they, especially in the beginning, if it was unwanted, there is a sense that there is something wrong with them and they need to make some changes. And there's, I think that's sort of a different avenue and a different question. But I did want to talk about sort of can a person change if there is a real need and desire to do so. But first, what I like to do is define things. So let's first start with personality. How do you define personality? What is the definition?
It's tricky to define
Hmm.
because I've seen it defined in many different ways that don't exactly complement each other either. But basically, what I would say fundamentally, it relates to a person's inborn nature. In a sense, it combines basically natural tendencies, predilections, inclinations with how they were reared, how they were raised, because there's no question that nature operates through nurture. You can't really see one as independent of the other.
Hmm.
So the main thing is there's some people who, as children, realize because of their parents' negative reactions to them when they act in a certain way that they have to kind of censor or limit that
Hmm.
expression. So one example would be if you're by nature sort of a loud, boisterous child, and your parents are both highly introverted and your talkativeness, maybe to them outspokenness, is something that they're uncomfortable with, then they will let you know explicitly and covertly that they want you to kind of contain or rein in whatever natural exuberance you might have so that you can end up basically not really expressing your nature so much as your parents' preferences for you. So it can be a real problem. And I would wager that anybody who has had to make significant alterations in their personality in order to emotionally survive the messages they're getting from their parents is probably not going to be very happy. So it's like if you're by nature extroverted and you're forced into sort of an introverted pattern, you may be confused about who you really are versus who you think you should be given the messages you've gotten externally.
Yeah, and I think
So I don't.
that's an interesting angle, and I think we'll take it. But that's a rabbit hole that I first want to, because I think it's really really important because I think it all starts with your childhood, right? Everything begins there, and that can really shape you. But I think that will be a bit of a rabbit hole that we'll dive into. So, but before we get to that, um, I want to ask: is it possible to change a personality then, if it's sort of an innate and developed sort of through your childhood? Is it possible, number one, and sort of a second part to that, are there certain aspects of personality that are easier to change than others? So in other words, maybe you're very introverted, but you want to be extroverted, or you're not a very curious person, but you want to be a curious person. Like, can you change, and is there certain aspects that are easier to change than others?
The more what you want to change seems to be inherent in your constitution, that it's core to your nature. Obviously, the more difficult it is going to be to change that. But to use your example, if you want to be more extroverted and you have a real motivation to work on that, because it's going to take some work, and you have a commitment to do that in the long term, then you can cultivate more relationships that maybe would be natural for you to do, spend more time with others than would be natural for you to do. But what it comes down to, if you get to a deeper level, that introverts are drained just by spending a lot of time with others,
Hmm.
whereas extroverts are energized all the more through their socializing. So you're going to need to kind of balance your, what should I say, self-trained gregariousness with solitude, or basically you will simply end up utterly exhausted and not be able to extrovert anymore.
Right.
So the balance is going to be different, because everybody, I think, needs a certain amount of solitude, but introverts need typically far more than extroverts.
Hmm.
But if you are motivated because you think you will maybe do better professionally, or be less inclined to be lonely, because introverts can still get lonely in their introversion if in fact they can't balance it with a certain amount of reaching out to others. That will be another frustration for them. So it is complicated. It's a matter of really knowing yourself
Hmm.
as well as possible to decide what you want to do and what is doable for you, or the extent to which it's doable. Now, if you want me to relate this to getting divorced and comfortably moving on, then the important thing is, if you initiated the divorce because you decided that the other person's values were just not in any way able to be harmonious with your own, I would think that wouldn't take that much change if, in fact, you get feedback from the person, your partner, who has decided she or he wants to divorce you. Then the main thing is, what can you learn about being in a committed relationship that maybe you didn't know, maybe you didn't understand, or maybe uh, being in that relationship required skills that you hadn't yet acquired or worked on. Then, to the degree that is not totally incompatible with your nature, I think you can probably make those changes. And I wonder whether you might be able to give me an example so I could address this more concretely.
Yeah, sure. So I think it is a tricky thing when you're left, because you automatically assume something's wrong with you, right? And so there can be this, I need to change, but it really was just an evolution or de-evolution or a falling apart, whatever kind of way you want to describe it, of the relationship, a change in the other person more so than yourself. But because you're being left, it can leave you with sort of all these questions. But for me, when I was left, I did a lot of looking in that mirror, and one of the things that I wanted to change about myself was how I handled conflict. And I was very much I will give you the silent treatment, because that's the mechanism that I developed as a child to deal with my parents' hurt and pain. I just
Right.
shut down, because if I don't talk to you and I don't hear you, then you can't hurt me. And so I would just shut down. And so, but after a lot of, again, looking in the mirror, you go and reading and talking to folks and diving into how to be a healthy grown
Partner.
grown man. um, I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. So that's something that I have now. I honestly, it's been 5 years next month. It will be 5 years since she left, and I haven't been in a long-term relationship. So I don't know if I've gotten any better at this. I don't know if this skill if I've developed it. I'm not sure, but that's for me was the biggest thing that I was trying and still probably am trying to change about myself.
Well, it's interesting because I think what you're talking about very generally is self-talk, teaching yourself to talk to yourself differently.
Sure.
And when I talk about what self-talk involves, more often than not, it's the adult part of you, the more resourceful, the wiser part of you, because we all learn from experience unless we're really shut down,
Sure.
to the child part of you.
Mm.
Because the child part of you thinks, wait a minute, the most important connection in my life is my connection with my parents. If I don't feel they accept me, I will be incredibly depressed because I will feel I don't belong to this family and it's the only family I've got. Now, if you say to the child, what you did was very clever of you, it was a way of adapting. And
Sure.
at your age, because it could have been at the age of 4 or 5,
Oh yeah.
you, of course, you would have come up with a defense mechanism that, by definition, would be very primitive because you're only 4 or 5 years old.
Right.
However, what I want to tell you is we're grown up now,
Yeah.
and our parents are no longer central to our existence. And we don't have to put first and foremost in our head that we'll be in big trouble if we don't continue with the silent treatment, if in fact not to say anything to our parents. In other words, they're not encouraging us to be assertive. So although assertiveness is, I think, a natural trait for all of us, it can be, in a sense, wired out of us by parents who let us know that for them, our assertiveness is inappropriate
Hmm.
because it makes them uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But you no longer have the need to do that. And the important thing to realize is if you're in conflict with somebody else who's an adult, they're going to feel that you're abandoning them.
Yeah.
That's not important to you,
Yeah.
that you're basically dissociating, you're not living in the present.
Yeah.
It never is helpful to be able to live or to take your past and put it into the present when in the present you need to be not reactive.
Yeah.
Because reactive suggests you're either going to blow up at them. Anger is a very popular defense because you don't feel you're losing power that way
Yeah.
when you're basically screaming at them,
Yep.
or basically to sort of absent yourself from the situation by deciding that you're simply going to dissociate.
Yeah.
You're sort of going to disappear before their eyes, not maybe physically, but they will realize that you're not accessible to them. And that can really hurt them. And it can really affect their self-esteem because it's not going to help their self-esteem to feel that in their committed relationship, the other person doesn't really care to engage with them in a situation of disagreement. And of course, you're always going to find things
Oh
to
yeah.
disagree on,
Sure.
unless you can basically create a clone of yourself and marry your clone. There will be differences, there will be
Sure.
disagreements.
Yeah.
And the main way of resolving a disagreement is to realize that their position, given their heredity, given all the environmental influences they were subject to, they can't possibly be comfortable with a viewpoint that is in opposition to their own. But if you no longer feel threatened by their differing viewpoint, you can say, okay, given what I know about your background, yeah, it's totally valid for you to take that position. And if in fact you can't know that because you don't know as much about their background as possible, you can always ask, what do you remember your parents either encouraging you or reinforcing in you, given what they were comfortable with, and what adaptations may you have made that are creating maybe at least some of the problems that we have had, because I know that the best way of resolving an agreement is simply for each of us to understand the subjective validity of each of our contrasting perspectives.
Yeah.
Because I guess I want to be able to feel you can validate me, even though your position isn't the same as mine. And I'm sure you want nothing less from me.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't I 100% agree with everything you're saying. And it wasn't a conscious effort on my part, or I wasn't conscious of the damage or the childlike nature of it. Honestly, I wasn't aware. I took my child skill set into an adult relationship, and that's never a recipe for success. I wish I would have had conversations like this, 10 years ago.
Where was I when you needed
Yeah,
me?
well, I was thinking the same. That's exactly what I was thinking. I was like, where were you like 10 years ago? Um, but I live and learn. I think the good thing is that now I'm aware, right? But I guess here's sort of the question. It's back to the original question, which is, that was sort of a part of my personality. I shut down. I don't talk to you. I disassociate 100,000%. Can I change that?
Right. And that is changeable because remember, even though you're calling it your personality, this wasn't something you were born with.
True.
And sometimes what you cultivate as a child, whether it's subconscious or conscious, is a way of fitting in better with your family. And that's when you can start basically um, getting yourself out of shape. And I've worked with people who literally at 40, 50, 60 years old are not clear about who they really are because at a very young age, to adapt to their parents' preferences, they made changes. And so, and if you know anything about codependency, it doesn't mean you're simply dependent along with someone else.
Right.
Codependency means that you put the desires of another person before your own because implicitly you believe that the relationship won't survive otherwise.
Hmm.
So, in a sense, all children are to one degree or another codependent with their parents, putting their parents'
Sure.
needs in front of their own so they can secure a more comfortable, as in less anxious connection with their parents than they could otherwise.
Yeah.
And that's why a lot of work that I've done as a therapist to get people to see that if they truly accept themselves unconditionally, then they will not continue to crave the acceptance of their parents who may not be capable of accepting them unconditionally. May basically, in one way or another, insist that the child conform to what makes them feel secure.
Yeah.
And where was I when you needed me? I would say over 10 years ago. I've been writing for Psychology Today now for, I think, over 16 years.
Hmm.
And I've published no fewer than 590 articles for them.
Wow.
And they've received almost 54 million hits. So a lot of people have been influenced by my writing, which is why I wanted to do more writing
Sure.
and, in a sense, less therapy so I could reach more people. But something like maybe 13, 14 years ago, I wrote a very popular article that was called The Path to Unconditional Self Acceptance. Well, once you unconditionally accept yourself, then you don't have to depend on somebody else's accepting you unconditionally or validating you because you can do it from within.
Yeah, that's really hard though, right? Because I mean, you start that sort of pattern, as you mentioned, sort of codependency on your parents, right? Because you're a kid. Where else would you get it? And no one says, "Hey, now that you're an adult, you have to figure out how to do this on your own." So it's absolutely, I think, the path, right? It is sort of being able to be um, able to stand on your own 2 feet, or not needing validation. Although validation can always feel good, right? But there's a certain skill around sort of feeling okay with who you are, regardless of anyone else and anything else. But that's really really fucking hard, right?
What it comes down to is, in all likelihood, You probably have a best friend who can accept you, even though they may not be identical to you.
Right.
So you have something external to internalize. If, in fact, let's say you've never had a really good friend and you've isolated yourself because you've had an inordinate fear of rejection. Because I once worked with somebody who basically so isolated himself because he felt constantly rejected by his parents, particularly his father, who just looked for things to criticize him,
Yeah. Yeah.
criticize in him all the time.
Sure.
And basically, I became the other person for him
Yeah.
to basically show him unconditional acceptance for who he was and who he wasn't. So at least he could internalize that. And it took quite a while. And eventually it did happen because it's almost impossible to internally see yourself as totally okay when you've got no evidence
Hmm.
from the external world that you are.
Yeah.
And even though he functioned well professionally, he was in an entry position as a software engineer and was afraid to move to the next step upwards for fear that he might fail at it. So he couldn't even get validation for that because he felt after 10 years or so, he should have been in a higher position professionally than he actually was.
Yeah, that just sprung something in me, and it's something I still struggle with. I've had successes in life, a lot of them.
Hmm.
This podcast being one of them. Honestly, I mean, I'm not rich and popular and famous and all that kind of good stuff, but 150 episodes for a guy in his basement in Pennsylvania is a good thing. But that said, I still struggle with taking compliments and receiving because the template, the baseline from my childhood was similar to what you described with your friend, where was my mother. She was just very critical. Obviously not to uh an extreme degree, or otherwise I'd probably be in jail or dead or whatever, right? There was some good within my childhood, clearly, or because I'm not a serial killer and all that kind of stuff. So but how do you as an individual who never really got compliments and only negativity, or mostly, how do you wrap your head around or become comfortable with receiving positive feedback that can help raise your self-esteem and your self-worth?
Excellent question. Have you ever asked your mother how she was raised?
Not so much. No, I think I've talked to siblings of hers, aunts and uncles and stuff, but not her directly. I don't think so. No.
Okay, so it's aunts and uncles, I assume from your mother's side.
Yep.
You could ask them, when you think back about how you were reared, did your mother have a strong tendency to be critical of you? Because unless your mother was scapegoated, she was the one person in the family that the mother always seemed to be verbally attacking. That's one thing. But there's a greater likelihood that your mother's mother and their mother as well
Mm.
thought that the way to raise a child, the way to socialize them, to prepare them for living on their own, was to focus on all the things they did wrong. And unfortunately, when that's taken to an extreme degree, it really affects the child's level of self esteem.
Oh yeah.
Now, if you had a conversation with one of your aunts and uncles, and maybe at some point with your mother, just saying, I'm curious, how was how were you reared? Did your mother look for ways of catching you doing something good, or did the focus seem to be very much more on what you weren't doing the way she thought you should be doing? And what I'm suggesting is whether it's directly with your mother or indirectly through one of your aunts or uncles, or maybe more than one, you can tell that child inside you, you thought it was about you.
Mm.
But no, it was about your mother's being programmed
Yeah.
to treat you in ways that made you think that you weren't good enough.
Yeah.
That was not her intention. That's how she learned to parent. once you can convince the child
Mhm.
that you are worthy, you are resourceful. Sure, you have your shortcomings. I have my shortcomings. We all do.
Sure.
But that basically you're a competent person and you've demonstrated that in various areas, then you can start to, in a sense, initiate a shift in how you see yourself. The way I like to put it, this could be useful for you, is how you think about yourself as the adult you are today is probably not at all the same as how you feel about yourself. Because if you think about young children, they're all about feelings. Cognitively, they're not very much developed at all. So when you find that there's a real contrast between what you think, in other words, I hear you telling me, you know you're competent. It still may not feel that way. And that's because your feelings belong to the child part of yourself. This is why in your self talk, you want to see yourself talking to the child, metaphorically embracing that child, telling that child that he, or in whatever case, she deserves to see themselves a lot more positively than they felt they could see themselves on the basis of the messages they appeared to be getting from their mother. Typically, the mother is more involved in the parenting than the father, but this can happen from the father as well,
Yeah, sure.
particularly
Um,
if the mother's deferring to the judgments of the father.
yeah, I mean, just personally, my dad was away a lot. He was a truck driver, so he wasn't home as much. So definitely everything fell on her shoulders. And that,
Right.
she gets a lot of the blame, and I try to understand. I do because I have two daughters, so I know how difficult it is. But I also know that, and I know you can look at this in different ways. I am not like her. Now you could say, well, that's good. Obviously, that's good, but it's maybe her behaviors led to you being a better parent, right? Sort of like don't do it like that type of thing. You
The
can
problem is if you do the opposite, you can move toward overindulgence
yeah, no,
and
I
basically
definitely don't do
create in
that.
your kid a sense of entitlement and
Sure.
do them just as much harm. So the main thing is look to what the authorities are saying.
Oh yeah, no,
Don't
I believe. I mean,
be
that's
doing the opposite of what a parent did because that
yeah.
may be excessive in another direction.
Yeah, for sure. But I mean, at least it made me it for sure made me a better parent. And you're right. You could swing the other way, but I'm definitely mindful to not be so critical. Right now, I don't praise everything because that's ridiculous. Like, oh, you put a sock on, congratulations, or whatever. Like, I'm not that bad. But but I try to be mindful of not being too critical. I definitely am, and maybe sometimes I go too far. I'm not sure. It's so hard
Do you
to
ever do you ever praise your child or at least acknowledge your child for the effort they put into something, even though they may not be successful? Because I think
yeah.
effort also needs to be rewarded.
I think so. I think I can't. I don't know 100%. Probably not every time, but I certainly don't. If they fail, I'm not tough on them in terms of like I was, like my parents were. Like the things I was told was you're never going to amount to anything. That type of stuff. Like you're always screwing up or whatever. So I don't do that for sure. Um, if they do mess up or whatever, I usually try to say, well, listen, you tried and you learned or whatever. So I think so. I think I try to do the right things, but I don't have no one's following me around with a clipboard 24/7 to make sure that I am sure I mess up left and right, but um, we're definitely getting off track. But I want to shift back a little bit. And this is great discussion, by the way. Thank you very much for doing this. If you are trying to make a change, what is one of the or what are some of the bigger factors that can allow that change to happen? Is it the environment? Is it I don't know, therapy? Is it a book that you would recommend, or like what are some things that really help people make it, if there is, to help them make a change that they're looking to make?
Okay, and I'm going to use a word that's probably my favorite word in the English lexicon, and the word is compassion. So rather than blaming your mother, if you take the position that we all do the best that we can, even though it certainly may not look that way with many people,
Yeah.
then you say, okay, I have to understand that my mother is essentially not a psychopath. She's not an evil human being.
Yeah.
She got programmed in certain ways
Yeah.
that seemed or felt to be necessary to her.
Yeah.
So if I am going to be more compassionate to myself, because when I talk about you're having a dialogue with that child part inside you that's still insecure,
Yeah.
because nobody's really healed that child.
Mhm.
The way you heal that child is through taking a compassionate stance toward that child. And that means you have to have self compassion to do that.
Yeah.
So if you see whatever mistakes you've made, or whatever ways that you might describe your behavior as misbehavior, as the best you could do given your programming, but that you have within you the ability to be self compassionate, which really starts with being compassionate toward your child's self,
Mm.
then that will naturally get extended to being more compassionate with others. And my sense is if you want more positive behavior toward yourself from your mother, the best thing you can do is probably offer her the compassion that she didn't get
Yeah.
when she was growing up.
Yeah. Yeah. You're not wrong. I know you're not wrong. I'm 47 years old, and you would think this shit would have been like solved or put to bed by now. But it's hard stuff, man. At least for me. Um,
Most people take this stuff to the grave with them.
yeah, I don't have any interest in doing that. I really don't. I really don't.
Right. And most people, if they could, if they were open and they were listening to our dialogue and say to themselves, I didn't know there was another way that would be tenable for me.
Yeah.
I think that itself would give them the motivation and help arm them with the commitment to say, okay, this may be a tough battle, but now I know it's a winnable battle, that there's nothing in my inborn nature that would get in the way with my developing more compassion for myself. And the only reason I don't have that compassion to begin with is I needed to have learned it from my parents and I couldn't get it from them.
Yeah.
And in all likelihood, there's no sense in blaming them because they didn't
Yeah.
have it in themselves to give to me. You
Yeah.
really can't be truly compassionate with someone else if you're not in any way compassionate with yourself.
Yeah. No, again, I know that you're right, and it's something I struggle with in terms of having compassion for her. I logically understand it, right? It makes sense to me. Of course, she didn't set out to be a shitty mom or what I would classify as a shitty mom, but she was. And so I understand that that was not intentional, and I understand that she did the best she could with what she had and all that kind of stuff. I understand it, but the feeling behind that it doesn't match up for me, right? There's a part of me that still holds contempt for her because of her behaviors, and it's again logically I understand it, I do, and I get it, and it makes sense. And if I was talking to anybody else, I would be like, come on, she did the best she could with what she had, right? I mean, that's a thing, that's a saying, that's true. But man,
But
there,
I'm suggesting you don't start with that. You
no,
start with that child inside you.
all right, fair enough. I
And when
like
you
I
say
like
that
that.
that's going to be easier, first of all, it should be a little bit easier than maybe dealing with being more compassionate toward your mother.
True.
But you see that as doable. And it's not
Yes.
one dialogue. Every day when you wake up, or a particular time of day when it's most convenient, you say, look, I need to apologize to you because in a way I've abandoned you.
Mm,
And I should be your best advocate. And because I know better than anyone else what you went through,
mm,
I am going to be there for you on a daily basis. And whenever you have a question you want to ask me, let me know and I will answer it. And you can even find out where that child is located somewhere inside you.
yeah.
Is the child in your chest,
Mm,
in your gut, in part of your head,
yeah.
in one of your limbs?
Yeah.
Because it helps if you can find a physical location for that child to make it as real as possible. And sometimes you can focus on a particular area of your body, just sense the child being there and say, tell me what you need. Tell me what questions you want me to answer for you, because I'm going to be there for you from now on an ongoing basis. And I think that is a way you can make the child, you can heal the child. Obviously, it's somewhat easier if you're dealing with a therapist who can help you with that,
Sure.
because that's the kind of thing I focus on
Mhm.
myself.
Right, right.
But the question is, ultimately, a person needs to learn how to be their own therapist, whether they start with a professional intervening in their behalf. And there's something called direct access, in which the therapist accesses the child and talks with the child, and you become the child, so you can start resonating and get more deeply in touch with the child. And at some point, I'd want to turn it over for you and help you establish just the right appropriate dialogue with the child, so the child hears it directly from you. But basically, if I'm talking to the child, at the same time, you are identifying with the child's experience by locating the child somewhere in or around you. You're also, in a sense, co-regulating with me. In other words, regulating your response with the child to be different from what it has been in the past.
Hmm.
Because
So
most people end up abandoning the child because the child is somehow intrinsic to all their negative feelings of insecurity and not being good enough.
it's almost like reparenting, right, in a way.
No, it's absolutely reparenting. And you're the one ultimately who wants to be doing it. And isn't it wonderful that it can be done?
Yeah, I mean that's I think again I say this all the time and it's been said many times on this podcast. I think that your childhood is where it all lies. All of your issues stem from that beginning, that you know, the genesis or whatever. Like that's it's where all the bad habits learned and programmed and all that stuff, it's where it all comes from there. So the fact that, yeah, there is absolutely hope in that you can sort of reparent or reprogram, if you will. I
And
think,
the way
yeah,
I see it is, if you look at your brain as a biocomputer, because literally it's a biocomputer,
true.
like any other computer, it can be reprogrammed, it can be deprogrammed. The main thing is, you don't want to have the new program on top of the old program. You want to basically work with the old program until it shifts into the new program. So the way I like to put it, you've heard of the expression, well, that's become second nature to me.
Sure. Yeah.
It's a wonderful expression, because what it's saying is it's not your first nature.
Hmm.
But if something has become second nature to you, what you are in effect saying, it is now your first nature, because you've reprogrammed your first nature to become your second nature, which thereby becomes your first nature again. Excuse the paradox, but it's absolutely, it's
No,
steeped in paradox.
I like it. I like it. I want to go back to and we'll ask this one and then my last question that I ask everybody, but I want to go back to the sort of the you were talking about, you know yourself and if and I think it mentioned it in the article or blog that I read, where it's, maybe you're really an extrovert but you don't really know it. How do you really get to know yourself? Like, what are some things you can do to sort of figure yourself out, especially again after a divorce? You have a lot of space and time suddenly. You don't, the way it shakes out nowadays, at least half of my time is completely free, like today, tonight, and tomorrow, and this weekend. And so I have all the time in the world, it feels like, to do some work on myself. What are some things I could do to sort of to figure out who I really am?
I think the first thing is to ask yourself how you needed to adapt to make your relationship with your mother as conflict free as possible. Because kids obviously don't want to be in conflict with their parents,
Hmm.
because it makes them feel, in a sense, alienated from people on whom they're still very emotionally dependent on. So if you think about, or you could think, when I was very young and played with friends, how was I different from the way I interacted? How were those interactions essentially different from how I interacted with my mother? So you can get a sense of what came naturally to you. Did you pick fights with your friends? Or did you generally have a pretty good give and take relationship with your friends that wouldn't work with your mother.
Mm.
So there are all sorts of ways in determining what is inherent in you in terms of your personality and what basically got programmed in, and to such a deep degree that you're absolutely right. You have to figure out what is essentially you and what basically sort of is a distortion of who you are. And some of it is good because the fact is, we can't always get our way,
Yeah.
and we
True.
have to learn about compromising. And a good parent will basically tell us, when we go to a toy store, I can buy you one toy. You might fall in love with a half a dozen toys. And if that happens, we'll review the 6 toys you fell in love with, and you will tell me which one you like the best, unless it was a $500 toy, because I don't have $500 to buy you a toy.
Right.
But basically, a good parent limits your choices, but doesn't take them away either. And it
Yeah.
sounds like you may have felt that you no longer or couldn't be at choice with your mother. And that's when you had to kind of remake yourself to install programs that were unnatural to you, but necessary.
Yeah. Man, there's
And they tend to generalize, and that's a problem.
well,
And they
yeah,
generalize with your wife because, yes, if there's a conflict, you need to develop good conflict resolution skills, problem solving skills. And frankly, a lot of people don't have them. So the default is either to give the other person the silent treatment or to blame them and to shame them.
yeah.
So you don't have to feel shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a whole lot of us that have these same issues, you know, like you said, like their conflict resolution is it's tough stuff. At least for me. But I get the feeling it's that way for everybody. You know, it's very rare in my life that I can remember a time when there was some kind of conflict and it was like a good, let's sit down and hash it out type of situation. You know, because people's feelings get hurt and their protection mechanisms spike up, and it's just because of the childhood and the pain and the shame and all those things, right? It's. But boy, if there is a skill that I would like to be much better at in general, it's yeah, conflict resolution. But it's tough stuff. Again,
And
at least for me.
what you can ask yourself is, I think you said your parents divorced. I forget.
No, my parents did not. My father passed away though he was 44. So eventually my
And you were
mother.
how old when he
I
was 40?
was I was 22. So
Okay. So you're
yeah,
already a young adult,
yeah,
hopefully go on your own path. But the main
yes.
thing is what people, maybe people listening to this podcast, can ask themselves, when your parents fought about something, did they reach a mutually acceptable solution? Or basically, at some point, did it just stop because it had to stop at some point, and then it got recycled? In other words, anything that isn't resolved is going to be recycled.
Hmm.
So if the person remembers, no, it's pretty much the same conflict, and I don't know that it ever changed or that they ever made any headway, then they know that they learned virtually nothing from their main models when they were young and growing up about how to actually resolve it. So then they can go on to another conflict, and it's very frustrating, and to your parents as well, when they try to avoid certain conflicts because they know they can't be resolvable until they build up such a head of steam that they have it all over again. And it's almost as though they could use a script that they had used 10,
All right.
20 years
Yeah.
ago because nothing has changed.
So that leads me to a question. I was gonna wrap up, but that my well, I think one of the issues, and I take full responsibility for my portion of the downfall of my marriage, 100%. And my parents fought all the time, and there was never resolution. It was chaotic and just terrible. It's surprised they never got divorced, but that might be because my dad died at 44. Anyway, my ex's her interpretation or her take on her childhood, and I could say that from what I've seen, I don't think she was lying. Her parents never fought. She'd never seen conflict. What does that do to a person?
the main thing is that they never fight because they agreed on everything, which I think is a pretty remote possibility,
Me too.
or that they never fight because both of them in growing up experience fighting between their parents is utterly futile.
Mm,
So they basically were programmed to avoid conflict,
mm.
because I can't, it's hard for me to believe that they agreed on everything.
Yeah, me too.
So the best thing is to see parents be in conflict and work it out.
Yeah.
And I would say that's probably a relatively small minority of parents
Mm,
because it takes an awful lot of sophistication and a strong ego to be
mm,
able to do that. So I like to make a contrast between having a strong ego, meaning you can accept criticism,
sure.
you can own what belongs to you in terms of shortcomings, versus a big ego. And a big ego, as I understand it, leads to narcissism,
Mm.
to a sense of entitlement, to a sense of being superior to your partner. And that doesn't help an intimate relationship at all.
Yeah, agreed. Well, Dr. Lee, thank you so much for doing this. This has been great. I'm really, really just pleased with the discussion, the dialogue, the your insights. I love doing this podcast, and this interview it reminds me of how much I love doing it. So thank you so much for coming on here.
Okay,
Um,
glad to participate.
so the last question I'd ask everybody is, what words of wisdom would you impart to a man who is just beginning his divorce journey?
I would hope there were a few words of hard-earned wisdom that I've already delivered. And maybe I would just go back with the best thing you can do for yourself is look at whatever failings or deficits you have had, that may be permanent. Maybe you'll never understand quantum theory or Einstein's theory of relativity,
Right.
and basically say, look, I got the gray matter that I got. I got more gray matter in one area than maybe in another. And I'm not going to hold against myself my limitations. If anything, I'm going to start celebrating them, saying, okay, this is not where I'm going to spend my energy because this is not a strength that I have.
Yeah.
I'm going to focus on the very strengths that I do have that I may have minimized or not paid tribute to. Because if I look at what my strong parts are and cultivate them to the highest degree I can, then I may find that I can accomplish things that I never thought I could earlier. And I can't think of anything that would be much more useful than to accept your limitations and grow your strengths.
Amen. Well, thank you again so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. How can people find you? You have a website. I know you're on Psychology Today, but is there any way for people that can reach you and
Now,
find anything you've done?
the best thing to do is to put in my name, first name Leon, Leon, last name Seltzer, S as in fizzling water, Eltzer, uh, and then add Psychology Today to it. I should come up number one. The name of my site is Evolution of the Self. So if you put in my name and Evolution of the Self, you'll get to the site immediately. There are ways of contacting me through the site,
Yep.
and I'm very responsive, so I will be sure to get back to you.
Awesome. Well,
And hopefully, nobody's going to have the time to read all 590 posts, but you might want to skim them to see whether there's something that directly addresses your issue. In fact, you could even write down your issue
mm,
just in the URL of your browser
yep.
and put my name there. And because I do this sometimes, so I've written so many posts that I want to be sure that this isn't a post I wrote 10 years ago and forgot all about it. So I will write what I intend to write about and then put my name next to it. And every once in a while, I would find that, oh, I already wrote that post.
Well,
But it's a good way of finding whether you have a specific question that I've already discussed.
awesome.
Just put in Leon Seltzer plus Evolution of the Self and look for where in the site you can contact me, because there will be something in one corner of the site and indicating to get in touch with. Click on this. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Okay. Glad
Okay.
to have a chance of joining you and maybe giving you some insights that you can use going forward.
You definitely did. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. Since my separation in July of 2019, I have done an incredible amount of work on myself. I've had many different therapists, life coaches, and went through different programs. I've taken all that I've learned and put it into my own program called Forged by Fire. If you are interested in having me help you navigate your divorce, please hit my website, risingphoenixdivorcecoach.com. I look forward to working with you.